The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a very special episode. What we've been doing, and what we will be continuing to do for the next little bit, is revisiting season 1, and with a new understanding of these people. And this is one that I'm really glad to have the opportunity to revisit. We're talking about the one, the only, Tits Out Frances Howard. And I mean, what an impact she has had on this podcast and everything. She's this is the second ever episode of Vulgar History. Her legend, her tits out ways. The listeners of this podcast, you voted yourselves to be called the Tits Out Brigade. I end every episode with, keep your pants on and your tits out. Like Frances Howard merch is in the merch store. Like, she's really an icon for us. Whenever I come across her in a book, like for instance, there's this newish book called The League of Lady Poisoners, which is a gorgeous book, by the way, written and illustrated by Lisa Perrin. It's a beautiful looking book. The illustrations are a huge part of it. And I was just kind of, at first, when I first got a copy, I was flipping through it to be like, oh, who's in here? Are there any of the Vulgar History people? And I stopped as soon as I saw her drawing of Frances Howard, like complete with like cleavage lines. I was just like, is that Frances Howard? I get so excited when I know her portrait is up in the National Gallery in London. I interviewed Rosie Hart a few months ago about her book, The Royal Wardrobe, and I was really excited Frances Howard was in that book, so I could talk to her about it. And significantly, I also, I want to say 2021, I interviewed a novelist named Lucy Jago, who wrote a novel that's called A Net for Small Fishes, which is, I feel like, if I was making curriculum, like a Vulgar History curriculum, like required reading, that would for sure be on there. That was the first author interview I ever did. And it's a novel, and Lucy did something like 8 years worth of research to get ready to write this novel. She knows more about Frances Howard than anyone. And I was so excited to talk to her, and reading her novel and then talking with her, I learned more about Frances Howard, and, such that I wanted to update this episode. And then the connections of people in the story that we've done episodes about later on. So I'm going to say a few thoughts now, Then we'll get to the episode itself, and I'll pop back on for like a whole lot of corrections, omissions, clarifications, and just a whole lot more tits out information. So first, I just wanted to give you, before you listen to this episode, which was recorded in 2020, the audio has been recently cleaned up by our magician of editing, Christina Lumagi, our editor of Vulgar History, just to make the audio sound more consistent with what the later episodes are. You know, the first season of Vulgar History, I was really very much figuring out what I was doing. How does this work? How does the microphone work? And so I know the audio quality of the early ones is not quite the same as the later ones. Like somebody told me, like they figured out, okay, they need to listen to the earlier episodes on their headphones. Like they can't play it in the car. Like the audio is just too muddy or whatever. Anyway, improved audio. So we're going to hear that episode. But before we do that, a couple things I'll tell you beforehand. So first of all, just in terms of people who are mentioned in this episode who have connections to people who I later did episodes on. So Frances Howard was married twice. Her first husband is named Robert Devereux. And his parents, so his father was named also Robert Devereux because people in like Tudor and Stuart England just like a name repeat. But anyway, so the first Robert Devereux, his dad, was the son of Lettice Knollys, who we talked about in an episode very memorably, who's quite a tits out lady herself. And Francis is the same guy, Robert Devereux Jr., Francis's first husband. His mother was Frances Walsingham. And if you're like, wasn't Frances Walsingham a man? Yes. So Francis Walsingham with an I at the end was the super spy, William Cecil's spy master in the Mary Queen of Scots saga. He had a daughter who he called Frances with an E, Frances, the female spelling, I guess, which is just like cause like the number of name duplications in this era. Then for a father and daughter, like for the same name to cross gender, is just like, I'm so excited when someone has any other name. You know, Ferdinando Stanley will always be a legend to me for that reason. Lettice as well. Anyway, so Francis's first husband, like that's his ancestry. His mother is Frances Walsingham, and his grandmother on the father's side is Lettice Knollys. The king in this story is James the 1st/6th, who is Mary Queen of Scots' adult son. We first talked about him on this podcast in that one panel graphic novel when Darnley was exploded and he was a little baby being like, avenge me, oh Lord. And then he grew up to be this just like shitty guy who, you know, he's the one responsible for the King James Bible. He translated it, inserted a bunch of misogyny and stuff about his like hyperfixation on witches. Anyway, he sucks. That's who the king is in this. His wife, the queen, is Anne of Denmark, who we have also later done an episode on. And we'll talk about her after the episode, just how much of a tits out legend she was. And other people involved in this. I just want to mention there's this upcoming mini-series that's going to be on Hepburn. Hepburn is here. She's my cat. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, she was just about to walk across the like mouse pad of my laptop, but she did not. Anyway, so there's going to be this Starz miniseries called Mary and George with Julianne Moore that's about George Villiers, who is one of the favorites of King James. So King James's favorite was Robert Carr, who was Frances Howard's second husband, memorably, but then he was supplanted by George Villiers. So anyway, George Villiers mentioned in this as well. And then also what I want to say is that if you want to read and learn more about Frances Howard, tits out Frances Howard, the whole affair, the best nonfiction book that I've come across, and this was a recommendation by Lucy Jago, is The Trials of Frances Howard by David Lindley. It's kind of the best, I don't want to say objective because no history book is objective, but it's the least, it's looking at the story from a point of view that's not assuming that Frances Howard is just a whore, but like being like, why are they going after her? Like what actually went on here? So anyway, it's the most fair version of it. The Trials of Frances Howard by David Lindley. And then also the novel A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago really imagines Frances's story even better. And part of what Lucy's research found is that consistently in letters and stuff, her family called her Frankie, which is a great name. Anyway, so here's the original Frances Howard episode, so we can all get on the same page, remember what her whole deal was. And then I'll be back afterwards with a whole lot of corrections, additions, omissions, and more information about Frances Howard. So yeah, I, current era Anne, will be back to talk to you in like approximately 60 minutes. Take it away, Anne of the past. let's just get into it, I guess. Today we're looking at the story of a woman named Frances Howard. She was born in 1590. So this is basically the Stuart era. So this is like after there was the Tudors, then there was the Stuarts. So it's like shortly after Queen Elizabeth's whole thing is when this whole situation is going on. And the thing about Frances Howard is I am so obsessed with her. I love her whole story. I love her whole aesthetic. I love everything about her. And so I've read about her a bunch already. And today I was thinking like, oh, I'm just going to see like what other podcasts are talking about her. And maybe I was like not searching well, but I feel like I'm good at searching. And I couldn't find any podcast talking about her, which is just like, I mean, I'm here offering the service of just like making this podcast about her because everybody should know her story. It is an amazing story. When I post this podcast episode, I'm going to put a picture of her, like a portrait, like painted while she's still alive, so you can all see what she looked like. And the thing is, I affectionately have come to think of her. And just a reminder that this podcast is called Vulgar History. So there might be some vulgar language used, and I'm about to say a vulgar word. And that word is tits, because she is tits out Frances Howard. If you look at the portraits of her, like there's nothing else anyone could possibly call her. It's not just like, oh, this was an era where women wore like low-cut dresses. Like, no. If you look at portraits of literally any other woman from this time period, which is the early 1600s, like Frances Howard is the only one who's like entire chest cavity, her like entire décolleté, it's like tits out. Like there's no nipples in these portraits, but that's just because they're portraits that were painted and not photographs. Like her entire chest is on display in every portrait you can find of her, including when she's an older person. Spoiler, she becomes an older person. Including when she's grieving, like spoiler, she is in mourning at one point. She's just like, it's just glorious. Like she just like is into her breast area and she is just like tits out Frances Howard. And that is also how she lived her life, just tits out. And this is like, I can't, there's a lot to this story. There is a lot to the story. The scoring is going to be pretty exciting, I think. So, Frances Howard. She was born in 1590. Her father was called Lord Thomas Howard, and I should say her last name was Howard, as in Catherine Howard, as in Henry VIII's fifth wife. Frances and Catherine aren't closely related, really, because the Howards were the super powerful, influential family in England at around this time. But like everybody in the family had like 17 children, and those children had 17 children. So basically, that's the lineage we're dealing with. It's a similarly powerful family. So Thomas Howard was married to a woman who was the Duchess of Norfolk. So Frances wasn't royalty, but she was a noblewoman. So she was rich. Her parents had titles. And so as per in this time and place, what that means is that the whole point of her was to grow up and marry somebody that would be beneficial to her family and that would bring money and prosperity and maybe hopefully more power to their family. And so in 1604, when Frances was, if you're keeping track, she was born in 1590, 1604, she is 14 years old and she got married to a 13-year-old boy named Robert Devereux. So I talked about this briefly in the last episode about Caroline of Brunswick, but there's this sort of assumption, stereotype that people in places like England in the 1600s got married when they were like 12 and then they had, 17 children and then they like retired when they were 20, like the lives were short, etc., etc. There's a lot of fallacies in that, including the fact that people didn't actually die young that much more. It's just the average age of death looks low because so many children died. Anyway, getting married at age 14 is not usual, but also when you're married when you're that young, it's not like, okay, go off, like have a house, be adults now. It's like often people got betrothed when they're that young, or they got engaged when they're that young. In this case, she got married when she was that young, but no one expected them to like run off and start acting like married people. Oh, and I should also mention, so they got married. Robert Devereux was also from a powerful family. So I was just going to say Robert Devereux, we need to explain about him a little bit. He's one of several men who are going to be included in this story. So Robert Devereux, 13-year-old husband of Frances Howard, is the son of a man who is also named Robert Devereux, who was Queen Elizabeth's favorite towards the end of her life. So Queen Elizabeth lived for quite a while, all things considered, and she got older and older and older, but it's sort of like in a reverse Leonardo DiCaprio situation. The men who she liked kept always being sort of younger men. So the older Robert Devereux was Queen Elizabeth's favorite for a while. And then this Robert Devereux is the son of that person. Just bear in mind as well, in 1601, so 3 years before this teenage wedding happened, the older Robert Devereux was executed for treason because he tried to overthrow the government. So like it's not like a calm time in the world generally. Francis Howard, Robert Devereux got married, but they didn't actually consummate the marriage because they were very young children. And also everybody knew that it was dangerous for 14-year-olds to get pregnant. And they wanted to wait until Frances had grown up and matured a bit, so she was able to do that. Basically, they were married, but a marriage is not official until it is consummated. So they just sort of waited a few years while that was happening. Robert Devereux, 13-year-old boy, just went off for sort of a gap year, just touring around Europe, and he was away for 2 years. And when he came back, Frances basically did everything she could to never be alone with him ever. And so you might think, well, isn't this the point? Aren't they now, what would they be, 16 and 14 or whatever? Anyway, she didn't want to be alone with him, partially because he had contracted smallpox during his trip, and she didn't want to catch smallpox and die. And also because while he was away, she had fallen in love with someone else. So the person who she had fallen in love with was called also Robert. Literally every man in the story is called Robert. Basically, it's going to be complicated. The other man who she fell in love with is called Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset. So we're just going to call him Somerset to tell him apart from Devereux, which is what we're going to call him as well. So Somerset was around Frances's age, just a few years older, and he wasn't from a noble family. I mean, people from noble families didn't tend to hang out with people from not noble families, so the thing was he had elevated himself, basically. So while Frances was off getting married as a young teenager, Somerset was a teenager, and he was a page in Edinburgh, which means basically, I think, the sort of person who would go and get a glass of wine for somebody more important, etc. While he was doing this, he made friends with a writer whose name was Thomas Overbury. And Thomas Overbury was not very important or influential himself at the time, but the two of them just kind of hit it off. They became super great friends. In this sort of when there's two people who are friends, there's often the one who's sort of the main one and the one who's sort of the sidekick. And in this situation, Somerset was the charismatic, ambitious one, and Overbury was kind of the behind the scenes, sort of quieter sort of person. So Somerset made a great impression on the king, who at this point was King James I of England. And we'll get into that in a bit, what Somerset did and why the two of them hit it off. But basically, Overbury supported him. He thought, this is great. My BFF is friends with the king. This is great for everybody. Somerset became one of the most influential people at court, with Overbury sort of as his hype man, sort of supporting him. So how did he meet the king? So in 1607, which is the same year that Devereux left to go on his gap year after the teenage wedding, Somerset was at a jousting match. We all know what jousting is. It's this wildly dangerous, quote-unquote, sport where knights put on their armor and then they race towards another knight, also in armor, on a horse, and then you poke at each other with your sticks. Somerset broke his leg during a jousting match, which is just ugh. In the first hand, it's 1607, medical care, not amazing. But also, it wasn't so bad. There's okay doctors around and stuff. And so the King James was oh my God, this poor, extremely handsome young man has just been injured. I, the king, am just going to nurse him back to health because that's just the sort of king I am / King James I, kind of like his aunt, Queen Elizabeth, just really liked really young, hot looking men. So basically they bonded in sort of a soap opera-y way where Somerset was convalescing and King James was, I don't think he was personally tending to him, but I'm sure he'd check in on him all the time. And they just got to be quite close. And Somerset became James's favorite. The king loved him so much that he knighted him. He made him a knight, called him the Viscount Rochester, hired him as a privy councillor. So this is just like every good thing happening to him. So the thing is that King James was easily swayed by who he liked and who he didn't like. He wasn't looking at things like very objectively. He'd just be like, who's my favorite person? Great. I'm going to make that person like the archbishop or whatever. And so since that was his personality, getting back to the Francis of it all, the Howard family were like, okay, so this is the king's personality. Like, if he likes you, he'll do nice things for you. So how can we make him like us, the Howard family? And so the thing is that by now, so again, Robert Devereux is off just like getting smallpox on mainland Europe. Somerset is here in England, and he and Frances have met each other at the court because she's a noblewoman and he's the king's favorite. And they basically totally fell in love. And so Frances's family was like, oh, okay, so our little baby Frances has fallen in love. She's captured the heart of the king's favorite. So this is great. Like, how can we use this relationship between this man and this woman to help bring more power to us, the Howard family? And so ideally what they would do is marry Frances to Somerset, but they can't do that because she was still married basically to Robert Devereux. But the thing is that she and Robert Devereux had never consummated their relationship. And if you haven't consummated your relationship, and I feel like this might even be true now, you've grounds for an annulment. You can say like it was never a real marriage. So basically Frances is like, this is great. I'm just going to get my marriage to Robert Devereux annulled, and then I can marry my true love, Somerset, a man who is himself in the midst of like a love triangle with potentially Thomas Overbury and the king. So that's a little love triangle, those three men, Somerset, the king, and Overbury. But then Somerset is in love with Frances, and then Frances is still married to Devereux. So this is like a 5-person like love quintangle. I'm not sure what the word would be when there's 5 people. So Frances is like, this is great. This is fine. I'm going to get my marriage annulled. I'm going to marry this man who I love, who is Somerset. Her family was like, this is great. She's going to get this marriage annulled. She's going to marry Somerset. And then we, the Howard family, are going to get all this power and influence. But meanwhile, Somerset's best friend, Thomas Overbury, was just kind of like, this seems like questionable. The Howard family had a reputation for being like maybe overly ambitious, for being sort of like cutthroat, sort of like Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, if he had a family with like hundreds of people in it. So Overbury was just like, I feel like Somerset might be trapped in some sort of like the web of this like seductress. / also Overbury was maybe jealous that Somerset was now in love with Frances because Overbury maybe had been in love with Somerset / maybe they were sleeping together too. I mean, a lot of things might be going on here. But one of the things that Overbury mentioned is that he was concerned, and this is like, seems to me, looking at this from the 21st century in Canada, reading about what happened centuries after it happened, that Overbury was jealous that Frances had taken all of Somerset's attention away from him. Frances was also from this like notoriously conniving family, but also I think Overbury was just like jealous, like basically. And so he sort of couched this in saying like, oh, I'm just concerned because Frances has a reputation for immodesty, quote unquote, which like, if you look at the portraits of her, I'm sure she had a reputation for immodesty because basically the tops of her dresses were just sleeves and then like waistband. Like her breasts were just like, voila, constantly. All the time. Look up any portrait of her. That's how you know it's a portrait of her. So basically, Overbury was like, I don't trust this woman, tits out Frances Howard. She's just like a bit extreme. And I feel like I just want to get back to just when things were like me and Somerset and we were bros and things were great. So he's a writer, remember, Thomas Overbury. So he published a poem called A Wife. And it was basically sort of like a 17th century sort of like incel manifesto where he just sort of like described where he was like, here's what an ideal wife should be like. Like number 1, like ideal wife, she should have dresses that cover her breasts. She should be like nice and quiet and not be called Frances and etc., etc. So it was basically a subtweet trying to get Francis to back off and for Somerset to realize like, oh my God, I have been fooled by this like femme fatale. What am I doing with Francis? Like, I'm going to break up with her. But guess what? That did not happen, but it made Francis and Somerset want to get married even more. And so Overbury was like, well, what can I do to stop my friend from making what seems to me like a terrible mistake? And this is like, here's my unsolicited advice for just like the world. If your friend is with somebody who's terrible, you can tell your friend the person is terrible. But if your friend doesn't listen to you, like what you should not do is like publish a poem. And then you should also try to not like actively break up your friend and this person. I mean, maybe there's situations where you should do that, but mostly like just let your friend make their own mistakes, basically. So Thomas Overbury was like, okay, my poem didn't work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to like start like lobbying the judges or whatever to not let Frances get her annulment because she's still married to Robert Devereux at this point. And as long as she's still married to Robert Devereux, she can't marry Somerset. And that's all Overbury wants, for Somerset to not be married to Frances. So Frances was like, okay, I see what's going on, because she was both tits out physically, emotionally, but also mentally. She was super smart, really savvy, super clever. And so she realized that Overbury was scheming against her. So she enlisted the help of the Howard family, which were basically sort of like a mafia almost, a family where it's just like, this is what's happening. And her whole family's like, we're on it. And so they set about getting Thomas Overbury kicked out of court. So she had a plan to trick Overbury into committing treason. And it seems like this whole thing goes all the way to the top, as they say, on My Favorite Murder, Georgia Hardstark, where even like the king's wife, Queen Anne, might have been involved. Like basically, it seems like everybody just like really hated Thomas Overbury. And so everyone, like literally everyone was on board of just sort of like kicking him out of court. The scheme was this. So Overbury was obsessed with staying near Somerset. He didn't want to leave him ever, basically, because they were best friends and he was best for him, / he was maybe in love with him, / was maybe sleeping with him. So Frances and the Queen, they sort of like used their womanly wiles and exposed chests to manipulate the king into offering Overbury the job of ambassador to Russia. And Overbury was like, oh my God, what an honor, but I can't go to Russia. I need to literally stay here, tied at the hip to my best friend, Somerset. And so basically, when the king tells you to go be the Russian ambassador, if you don't do it, then that's treason. And so there's also sort of hints that at this point, the king himself might have not even needed to have been manipulated to do this. Like he wanted to get rid of Overbury as well, because the king was probably in love with, probably sleeping with Somerset as well. So this is just like, it's not a love triangle. It's just like Somerset in the middle. And around him are there like 3 to 5 people who are all in love with him and who are all sleeping with him. And where it all sort of turns is that one of those people is Frances Howard, and she's just like tits out, and she's going to make this happen for her. So basically, the king was on board with getting rid of Thomas Overbury because he was jealous of the time that Overbury spent with Somerset, because the king liked to be with Somerset. And this is just all like, this is where it gets complicated. This is where I feel like, of course, other podcasts aren't talking about this. This is like not a straightforward narrative. So just to recap, so we've got Somerset, who is this man who is the favorite of the king. They're probably sleeping together. Somerset's best friend is Thomas Overbury. They're probably sleeping together. So the king is jealous of Somerset's relationship with Overbury, but Overbury is jealous of Somerset's relationship with Frances Howard, tits out Frances Howard, who is still technically married to Robert Devereux, formerly a teenage boy, now an adult man, recovered from smallpox, hasn't been in the same city as her for a really long time. So these are the puzzle pieces and what's becoming rapidly sort of a weird, sexy version of Clue set in Stuart era. So basically, Overbury had been tricked into committing treason by refusing to become the ambassador to Russia. And so he was arrested and put into jail in the Tower of London. And after 5 months, he died of quote unquote natural causes. So with Overbury out of the way, Frances finally was able to get on with the whole annulment scenario. The way that this worked in this time for this married sort of couple was that Frances and Devereux both sort of went into a courtroom. And so Frances testified that she had done her best to have sex with Devereux. And she says that, like, she tried to have sex with him, but he was just like not able to have sex with her. He was impotent, she alleged. And so the proof of this is that, I just want to clarify, because I think I got a bit mixed up, which means you're probably a bit mixed up as well. So they got married when they were 13 to 14 years old. Devereux went away on a trip for 2 years. Then he came back. While he was away, Frances had fallen in love with Somerset. And then once he was back, she basically, even though they were husband and wife, she just like never went to bed with him ever, is what she did. And so she alleges that he was impotent, so they couldn't have sex, which means the marriage was invalid, which means that she should be able to get an annulment. So the main evidence in a trial where you're trying to prove that your husband, when you're Frances and you're in this time and place, and she's trying to prove that her husband was impotent, the main evidence is her virginity. Basically, was her hymen intact or not? Because this is a culture and a time and place where a young woman was sort of expected to just never have sex until she was married. And so Frances is saying like that she never had sex with her husband, even though she was married. So technically she should be intact. In order to investigate this, super fun. So she was examined by 10 matrons and 2 midwives who just did a little gynecological exploration to see whether her hymen was intact. And in so doing, they found that yes, she was still a virgin. But plot twist, it wasn't really Frances who they were examining. So Frances was like, I am happy for you guys to investigate my hymen's intactness, but I'm also so shy. I'm so shy. Can we just do it in a room with a veil covering my face? And can I just like go in the room for a minute first, put a veil over my face, and then you'll come in? And they were like, that's totally reasonable. We've seen portraits of you and have no reason to think that you're not a shy person. So basically, she allegedly, rumor has it, switched places with somebody who was a virgin for this inspection. It's entirely possible Frances herself did not ever have sex to this point. If you're looking for the Occam's razor of it all, like, and then the investigation was actually of her, but that's just like, I'm guessing that she switched places with somebody. So this is all happening. The midwives examined her and they found they're like, yep, she's totally a virgin. That means her husband must have been impotent, but Devereux, who was, guess what, the worst. So he got up on the stand and he was like, actually, I am super virile. I've had sex with so many people before, and it's actually Frances's fault that we never had sex. So he confirms the fact that they never had sex, but he's saying it was her fault because she was so gross and ugly. He got some of his friends to come up and testify for things like, I've seen him with an erection, which means he's capable of being aroused. So like he clearly could have sex, just for some reason with Frances he wasn't able to. So Devereux was like, Frances was mean to me, she's sexually unappealing, so I was just unable to have sex with her, but it's her fault. And basically this was all happening in court, lots of witnesses there hearing all of this talk about sex and hymens and erections, and it got really, everyone was kind of talking. If you've seen like The Favorite, the movie that was from like just a few decades later, people around the court, they like a good little piece of gossip, and this is just like beyond. But wait, it gets weirder. So suspicions start to come up that perhaps Devereux has been bewitched, like Satanism might be involved in why he wasn't able to have sex with Frances. So for a while it was looking like he might be sent to Poland for an exorcism, because apparently that is where you went for exorcisms back then. But basically, eventually the king, King James, intervened and was just like, you know what, we're just going to like grant this annulment. And the trial basically was ended. 3 months later, Frances was able to marry Somerset. And So things sort of were looking happily ever after adjacent until it wasn't, because 2 years after Overbury had died, someone finally noticed that he hadn't actually died in prison of natural causes. He had actually been murdered by poisoning. This is where we get into the next whole weird bit of the whole saga. So basically what happens is Frances and Somerset go back to court. This time, instead of her virginity being on trial, Frances is on trial for murder with accomplices. So one of the accomplices is Somerset, and then there's 4 other accomplices. During the trial, the whole scheme came out. So basically what happened was this. So Frances had conspired with some other people to get Thomas Overbury thrown in prison, because she knew that once he was in prison, she had enough safeguards in there to poison him to death. So she had used her, presumably, tits out powers to have the Lord Lieutenant of the Tower of London removed and had him replaced by a man much more morally flexible. The new Lord Lieutenant was a man named Gervase Helwys, which is like quite a name. And then there was also another jailer who she had, who was working for her on the inside, who was a man named Robert Weston, who knew a lot about how to kill people with various pharmaceuticals. And the thing is that even though Overbury was in jail, he was still like a wealthy person. So he wasn't like shackled to a wall in a cell. He sort of got like an okay room, sort of like a hotel room. And Richard Weston was like his concierge. And then finally, the final conspirator was somebody named Mrs. Anne Turner, who was the wife of a physician, and she was also herself a part-time brothel owner. So she had access to a lot of drugs. So she was able to get the drugs. Weston was able to smush up the drugs and mix them in the food. And Gervase Helwys was sort of like there to look the other way. Oh, and there was one other person whose name was Simon Franklin, who was an apothecary. Presumably, he had something to do with the drugs as well. And the drug they decided to use to kill him with was sulfuric acid. How do we know all of these things? This is like a lot of details to know about something. And the reason we know this is because Frances basically pled guilty. She admitted to having done all of this stuff. But Somerset pled innocent. So the couple was sort of... There's a novel that came out a bit ago called The Poison Bed by E.C. Fremantle. And side note, it's because of the novel that I first started reading up about this actual historical event. But the novel is sort of like Gone Girl, where you're not sure if she's guilty, if he's guilty, if they're both guilty, like who's telling the truth and who's not. But what happened in history was Frances pled guilty and it copped to everything. When Somerset said he had nothing to do with it, it was totally all Frances doing everything. Either seems plausible to me. I feel like Frances was obviously capable of planning this all herself, but also like, how would Somerset not have known about it? Anyway, the king, still James I, who's still infatuated with Somerset, was basically, he's like, ooh, this is starting to look bad for me. People are starting to suspect that maybe the king and the queen had something to do with it because the whole like sending Overbury to Russia scenario. So he tried to encourage Somerset to plead guilty so they could like wrap this up quickly. And basically if Somerset pled guilty, then James could pardon him and it would all be done. But Somerset was just like, no, I'm not going to plead guilty, which is where I feel like it could be that he's innocent. But also if he pled guilty, yeah, the king could pardon him, but what if that didn't happen? What if he was found guilty and then got to be executed? Anyway, fun fact. So there was a jury of all men because it was a time of all men juries. And do you know who one of the jurors was? This might be part of why Somerset didn't want the jury to decide his fate. Because one of the jurors was Robert Devereux, Frances Howard's ex-husband, the one who was proven in a court to be impotent, who had smallpox as a teenager, etc. So basically, Devereux was eager to sentence both of them to death because they had crossed him. They had forced him to stand up in front of everybody in England and be like, yes, I can have erections. This is just like, I can't even. So the verdict was decided upon. So what happened was that they were not sentenced to death, but to life in prison. Frances and Somerset were because they were rich, and also James, liked them. But the other 4 who were not wealthy were all hanged for their role in the death. So that means Gervase Helwys, Richard Weston, Anne Turner, and Simon Franklin were all executed for their role in this whole situation. Frances and Somerset both found guilty, sentenced to life in jail, but Frances was pardoned almost immediately. Somerset was also soon after, so they weren't even in jail for that long. Basically, they spent about 2 years in the Tower of London, which again, as rich people, it wasn't like shackled to the wall. It was sort of just like an okay hotel situation. Clearly, they got to visit each other sometimes because Frances got pregnant and gave birth to a child while they were living there. It was a daughter who they called Anne, nice name. And basically, they left prison and just like kept going. They lived the rest of their lives out of the public eye. Basically, they stayed away from royal court. They were just sort of notorious people that everybody would sort of be like, oh my God, do you know who that is, when they went out anywhere. The whole thing was so dramatic that a number of plays and poems and other writings came out over the next few years, inspired both by the events of Frances's annulment trial and the whole like virgin switcheroo, as well as the whole murder thing. Posthumously, Thomas Overbury's poem A Wife became a best-selling poem because of his connection to the crime in that he was murdered. And because the poem A Wife, everybody knew, is a subtweet of Frances Howard, who is like the most notorious woman in the world. Basically, the poem was not out of print for the next 60 years. And if you're wondering what happened to Robert Devereux, he did get married again, but he never fathered any children, legitimate or illegitimate. So maybe he was impotent? Who's to say? Frances Howard passed away in 1632, aged 42 years old. Her husband, Robert Carr, passed away 12 years later. Their daughter, Anne, lived a long and healthy life. And the king, King James, stayed king for a while, but this is just like one of many examples of why he kind of got a reputation of being like not a squeaky clean sort of guy, sort of like a morally questionable type person. If you want to read more about this, there's so as I said, there's the novel, The Poison Bed by E.C. Fremantle. And there's also 2 nonfiction books that I read to consult to write this. There's The Overbury Affair by Miriam DeFord, as well as Unnatural Murder, Poison in the Court of James I by Anne Somerset, who is an author who seems to be a descendant of Frances Howard and her daughter Anne. And now it is time to score this on the scandaliciousness scale. And this is like, okay, there's four categories. And this is just like, first we're going to start with scandaliciousness. So this is like the quality, like how juicy and gossipy and like messed up is this story. And this is like this has got murder that Frances Howard admitted to, that she was sent to jail for. We've got the scandalicious neckline of literally every bodice of every dress she ever wore. We've got the whole was she a virgin or not trial. Like I can't not give this a 10. This is a 10 out of, I can't think of anything she could have done. Like the scandaliciousness of the fact that Somerset was in his own gay love triangle with the king. Like this whole story, it's, if I could give it more than 10, I would, for scandaliciousness. In terms of scheminess, again, I feel like Frances Howard, she had the scheminess, like with the support of her family. I guess the question is like, how much was her and how much was her family sort of helping figure all these plans out for her? But basically, a lot of this rested on her, and she was able to pull off a lot of stuff. She was able to pull off getting the annulment, the virginity switcheroo, like conscripting 5 other people to murder somebody with her. Like her scheminess, I'm going to give her an 8 for scheminess. The next category is significance, which is interesting because like, so the significance category, that would be like, did Frances Howard invent algebra? Did she, I don't know, like did one of her descendants end up becoming the next queen or whatever? Like basically in terms of the, like it was a huge scandal at the time. I mean, 10 out of 10 for scandaliciousness. The significance was a factor in the reputation of James I, which sort of tarnished the reputation of his son, Charles I, who was kicked off the throne by revolution. So it was like, there's some significance to this, but it's like one part of a bigger thing that affected British history. So I love her. Frances Howard is my girl, but I'm just going to give her, I think, a 3 for significance. And the final category is sexism. This is like giving more points dependent on how much did being a woman in a patriarchal society affect what happened to her. And this is an interesting one to think about because Frances Howard kind of saw the cards she was dealt, being the daughter of this wealthy family, being married off to this guy, and she kind of she found ways to work with that and to make it work for her. Like, obviously sexism, basically everybody's going to always at least get a 5 in sexism because that was just always a part of everyone's life. I mean, the fact that she had to prove her virginity in the trial, like that's pretty shitty, where she had to prove that she wanted to have sex but couldn't. Like, other than that though, like, people didn't like, I'm gonna stick with a 5, like a 5 in the category of sexism. So that gives her 18, 19, 21, 26 out of 40 in the scandaliciousness scale, which is like a really good score. I mean, we just went through literally everything that she got up to. I mean, this is the highest score so far. I know it's just the second episode, but I'm interested to see where other people are going to score. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Ah, the web tore. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, Silly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket is in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. Hey, it's me, Anne. Modern day Anne, and I've got so much information to add to that episode about Frances Howard. The first one is a correction. When I first was looking at Frances Howard, and if you look up Frances Howard, just do like a Google image search or whatever, you're going to see the famous portrait of her that's in the National Portrait Gallery, the one that our artwork in the merch store, designed by Deborah Wong, that says tits out. Like, this is a portrait we all know. She's wearing red. She has this mischievous look in her eyes. She has sort of like darkish hair and tits out. You know, that's a portrait. There are all kinds of other portraits, not all kinds, 3 to 4 other portraits of what I thought was the same person, but in fact is another person whose name was also Frances Howard. So these other portraits, she has her hair down and it's kind of blondish hair. She's got paler features, tits out as well, but that's a different person. And I just thought it was the same person because, portraits can look very inconsistent depending on who's painting and when. I thought it was all one tits out person, but in fact, there was a second person called Frances Howard who was also tits out. And her story, I'm just going to summarize briefly because it's also got some wild connections. And she was cousins of our original Frances Howard. They were both in the court of James I and VI simultaneously. Like, can you imagine just the tits out energy of both of these people being there? So they weren't siblings, but they were both from the Howard family, which is just like a family where like every woman had like 14 children. So like they were cousins to some extent, I guess. Anyway, so the other Frances Howard was born in 1578, which is 12 years before the original Frances Howard. So although the Frances Howard, tits out Frances Howard, like I'm going to call her the original Frances Howard. The other Frances Howard, even though she's older, is the other Frances Howard. There's going to be a third Frances Howard, but wait for that. Anyway, so the other Frances Howard was orphaned at a young age and then was married off to Henry Purnell, the son of a rich wine merchant, an alderman, and a patron of the Virginia Company. So we're getting some American content here, and that is going to continue the connections to people who were portrayed in the Disney film Pocahontas are going to come up. Anyway, so they were married in 1592. I'm just going to do some quick math. So she's like 14-ish. This marriage displeased William Cecil, remember William Cecil, who was like Queen Elizabeth's guy. He had other plans for the other Frances because she was the descendant of two dukes. He had other plans for her than marriage with a vintner, a wine merchant. He was so upset that her husband, Purnell, wrote a letter of apology to Cecil being like, hey, I'm sorry, this marriage was arranged. My bad, or whatever. Anyway, he died 7 years later, Purnell, this husband. And so the other Frances Howard was left a wealthy widow at age 20, 21-ish. She was a woman of enormous social ambition, apparently. She abandoned a suitor, Sir George Rodney, and in order to have a super secret sexy marriage. And I do want to just state all this information that I'm telling you is from wikipedia.com, just for the record. Like there's some facts there. Anyway, so this guy, Sir George Rodney, wanted to marry her, but she was like, no, I have higher ambitions. I'm the daughter of dukes. And she super secret sexily married the widower Edward Seymour, the first Earl of Hertford, in 1601. So that's like 2 years after she was widowed. So she's like 23, 24. And you're like, oh, Edward Seymour. We've talked about a lot of people called Edward Seymour on this podcast. Which one was this? Oh, you know this guy because it's literally Ned Seymour, the same guy who had married Lady Catherine Grey, which we talked about in the Lady Jane Grey season. And if you're like, why and how is he still around? Isn't this like a generation later? Yes, that happened 2 generations ago. He, at this point, so the other Frances Howard was like 24. He was literally 60 years old. And it's the same guy who married Lady Catherine Grey. I lost my mind when I saw that. So the other Frances Howard was, in fact, his third wife. He had been married to Lady Catherine Grey, who died in prison. I did a whole episode about that. Then he married someone else who we'll talk about in a sec. And then the other Frances Howard was his third wife. So because it was a super secret sexy marriage, it was performed secretly without banns or license. And the guy who did it was this guy called Thomas Montfort, and he was suspended for 3 years later when it was found out that he had thrown this super secret sexy marriage. And if you're like, Ned Seymour, like, did you not learn a lesson from when you like had your first super secret sexy marriage to Catherine Grey, whatever, like 40 years ago? Like, why would you do another super secret sexy marriage? You're 60 years old. Like, you know how badly this can go. And the thing is, that's the only kind of marriage he knows how to do. So his first wife was Catherine Grey. His second wife was a third person, also called Frances Howard. So he has super secret sexily married 2 people, both called Frances Howard, neither of whom is the person that this episode is about, tits out Frances Howard. So it's just a name a lot of people have. So this third person, Frances Howard III, who is this? More connections. So this other Frances Howard was the sister of a woman who we've mentioned named Douglas Sheffield. And you might remember her because it's rare then and now for a woman to be named Douglas. Douglas Sheffield was the mother of Robert Dudley, aka Bobby Dud's illegitimate son, Robert. And Douglas Sheffield, FYI, was given that first name in honor of her godmother, Margaret Douglas, who we've also talked about. That's Darnley's mom. And in fact, Frances III and her sister Douglas were apparently rivals for Bobby Duds, I guess with Elizabeth I as well. This marriage to Frances III had also been a super secret sexy marriage, which truly is the only kind of marriage Ned Seymour knows how to do. And it was so secret that nobody found out about it for nearly a decade. Frances III continued on at royal court. Nobody knew that she had married this guy. In 1595, so that's before he married the other Francis. Anyway, at one point, Edward, but he's fully a grown-ass man. He's 50 years old or whatever. He tried to have this marriage to Francis III set aside in 1595 because he wanted to clear the way for his sons to maybe have a claim to the throne, the sons he had had with Catherine Grey, but they had been named illegitimate. But to have this marriage set aside, that meant he had to reveal it had happened, and it was a super secret sexy marriage, which was illegal. And so he was arrested again. Anyway, this guy just is living his own Groundhog Day situation, repeating the same mistakes over and over. You know that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting it to happen differently. Guess what happens when you super secret sexily get married? Ned, you get thrown in jail. You goddamn dumbass. Anyway, Frances III died in 1598. She was buried in Westminster Abbey. So if you go to Westminster Abbey, just to make everything extra confusing, presumably the name Frances Howard is there. And if you, a Tits Out Brigadier, you're oh my God, Frances Howard, I love her Tits Out legend. Maybe this one was too, but this is Frances III. This is not the Tits Out Frances Howard, who's in Westminster Abbey. So anyway, she died. And then he was you know what I'm going to do? Marry someone with the same name as my previous wife. I don't have to change. The napkin embroidery is great. I'll just marry someone else also called Frances Howard, who is the other Frances Howard. Anyway, so this third marriage also exploded in his face. People found out about it and he got in trouble yet again, because that's his shame kink or whatever. So you remember the other Frances had this suitor called Rodney, who she cast aside to marry him. Rodney was really upset about this. He shut himself up in a room at an inn, wrote a large paper of well-composed verses, he wrote a long poem to her, to the other Frances, in his own blood, and then ran himself upon his sword, is what Rodney did about this. So she had quite an effect on him, and he had some issues as well, clearly. Anyway, so this person, the other Frances, was named a Lady of the Bedchamber to Anne of Denmark, who we will talk about in a second a bit more. And apparently Anne of Denmark really loved her and she was fond of her. She wore a miniature portrait of the other Frances Howard. So the details are not here and will be here forever if I get into the details. But so a locket or a locket ring. So now I'm thinking were these two lovers? Anyway, she liked her a lot, the other Frances. Anyway, so we just know a couple more things about the other Frances Howard. Although one might think that she, when Tits Out Frances Howard stuff was going on, I think the other Frances would want to be no, that's not me. I didn't poison anybody. I'm the other Frances Howard. So November 1603, the other Frances wrote to her husband's steward about purchases to be made as Christmas gifts. So we know from the Mary Queen of Scots stuff, these are the sorts of ways we learn what people are like. What gifts were they buying for people? What purchases were they making themselves? One of the gifts she wanted to give to somebody was an embroidered nightcap to be worked in black silk, gold, and silver thread. Very fair and not grossly wrought, she wrote. And then she was this is the person who I know. This is the Etsy shop I recommend you buy it from. And then she wrote her sister Mary would be able to help him choose one. But what I'm telling you this and why I think it's notable is because she wanted to choose one to pass off as her own work. She would pretend that she had embroidered it herself. Anyway, so you know what? I respect the hustle. That the vibes is buying a cake in Costco and then putting it on a pan and messing up the frosting a little bit to pretend you made a cake. We know that Anne of Denmark liked to have mask parties and put on plays starring herself. The other Frances appeared as Vesta in the Queen's Masque, The Vision of the 12 Goddesses in January 1604. This is all happening early 1600s. The other Frances Howard, the Overbury murder and trial and stuff, that was 10 years later. So that happened. I'm sure she spent a lot of time being that's not me. That's this other Frances Howard. She can't say no relation because they are related, but it's just no, just someone with my same name. Totally not me. Anyway, so Ned, her elderly husband died in 1621. And 2 months later, which I would say is scandaliciously quickly, she married, and this is another connection, she married Ludovic Stewart. I love people with memorable names because when they pop up again, I am like, I know that name. Ludovic Stewart is the son of Esme Stewart. So Esme Stewart was King James's uncle / first gay crush. So Ludovic, his son. So he's got some connection to the royal family, the Stuarts. Yeah, so Ludo, as he was called, was the cousin of the king, King James. He was a privy councillor, steward of the royal household. And because of this marriage, this now made the other Frances Howard Duchess of Lennox. So because James had given the Lennox title to Esme, his uncle / crush, and then it passed down to Esme's son, Ludo. So here's a story that was relayed by somebody called Joseph Mead. It's just a funny thing that happened in 1622. So the king had asked for a gold chain to give to an ambassador as a parting gift. A chain that happened to belong to his wife, Anne of Denmark, was brought for his approval, but he thought it was too valuable to give as a present because we know he was a frugal bitch. Prince Charles, his son, his older son, not hot Prince Charles from later, don't worry, this is just another guy called Charles, suggested that instead he should present this chain to the new Duchess of Lennox, the other Frances Howard, as a gift. And so the king agreed, and his son, the prince, presented the chain to the other Frances and placed it around her neck. But according to Joseph Mead, who I appreciate your writings, Joseph Mead, I'm always here for a messy bitch living for drama, writing down the messy dramas happening. But according to him, like seeing this happen, somebody was upset about it. And the somebody who was upset about it was Mary Villiers, who is the mother of George Villiers, who is played by Julianne Moore in that upcoming Starz series, Mary and George. And so she was the one, she's like the pageant mom who's like pimping out her son, George Villiers. And her whole thing was like, I want my son and myself to be like the most favoritists. Anyway, so she was jealous to see this chain being given to the other Frances. And so she decided to acquire it, like AKA steal it. So she sent a messenger to the other Frances pretending and got the messenger to pretend to be from the king. Like the king was asking it to be returned, but the messenger was going to actually give it back to Mary Villiers. The other Frances like knew what game she was playing. And she was like, I'm sorry, what? And so she questioned the messenger and the fraud was exposed. And the scandal was such that Mary Villiers was asked to leave court for a while because she's a messy bitch, and just adding to my notes of people to maybe talk about on this podcast. Anyway, but then, just to be fair, like this is like third-hand gossip being reported by this guy, Thomas Mead. So it was maybe unfounded rumors to try and make Mary Villiers look bad, but like, whatever. It's a good story. The other Frances was also given a jewel set with diamonds in the form of the letter H, I guess for Howard. This had belonged to Anne of Denmark. So, those two are besties. I'm just throwing it out here, maybe lovers, based on no evidence. Anyway, she got lots of jewelry as gifts, and then her husband Ludo got like various titles. So Ludo was named the Duke of Richmond in 1623, which meant that she was the Duchess of Richmond, and she became known as the Double Duchess because she was the Duchess of Lennox and the Duchess of Richmond, and she was literally called the Double Duchess, which, I mean, you can't not. Double Ds. So this is the other Frances Howard now, double Ds. Ludo died suddenly. Was he murdered? You decide. Anyway, he died with no children of his own. The dukedom of Richmond and the earldom of Newcastle upon Tyne became extinct upon his death. The dukedom of Lennox was inherited by his younger brother, also called Esme Stewart, because we're just doing a lot of name repeating here. Anyway, the other Frances Howard, double Ds. She retained the title Duchess of Richmond, so she stopped being double Duchess at this point. I guess that's why I mentioned it. The other Frances Howard was also buried in Westminster Abbey next to her third husband, Ned Seymour. Like, is his other wife also Frances III buried there also? Anyway, so if you go to Westminster Abbey, you're going to see the name Frances Howard potentially twice as a person who was buried there. And one of them is this one, the double Ds. The other one is Frances III, who we know much less about, but she was married to him for 10 years and he pretended they weren't. Anyway, so she was buried next to him in the magnificent tomb she had erected in his memory. Now, I mentioned before characters from the Disney movie Pocahontas. Now, I do have in my long-term planning, I'm really hoping to invite on a special guest to do justice to the story of the woman best known as Pocahontas. Her name was Matauka, actually. So we're going to get into all that later. I have done on Patreon a So This Asshole episode about John Smith. But so do you remember why I did a Patreon episode about John Smith? Because he was one of the people fighting in, where was it? Romania? Like the Elizabeth Bathory story. Like Captain John Smith just became a captain because of his fighting there. Anyway, but he's connected to this as well. Because remember, her first husband was involved with a Virginia company. Later on, so I guess that like America was like of interest to her, double D's. And so she, as a widow, she provided financial support for the publication of Captain John Smith's book / pamphlet, The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles. And that's his like book of like wild lies, making himself sound heroic when actually he's a dirtbag. That book was published with a dedication to the illustrious and most noble princess, the Lady Frances, Duchess of Richmond and Lennox. Anyway, I had to share all those connections because it's wild. It was quite a while ago, and I forget your name, I'm so sorry. But a member of the Tits Out Brigade is the one who alerted me to the fact that there was another Frances Howard. And then she and I remember we were both reading through the Wikipedia and like clicking links together. And I was like, oh my God, do you know who her husband was? Literally the same guy as Catherine Gray. And we were both freaking out about it. So thank you to that person for bringing this to my attention. But also I wanted to mention it because in the podcast you just heard of Past Me, you know, I'm talking about all these portraits and her tits are out. And it's like her tits are out in the portrait that exists, Tits Out Frances Howard. Double D's are also out in her portraits, but that's two different people. And you can tell the difference because Double D's always has her hair down and is kind of blonde. Our Frances Howard hair is up and she's wearing a red dress with a yellow ruff. So further corrections I wanted to mention. So the tits out neckline, which is what first caught my attention about the original Tits Out Frances Howard. From now on, I'm only talking about her. I'm going to stop differentiating. So I said in the episode, and I had thought, like, people of this era, like, did not have this neckline. Like, she was, like, doing a tits out thing, and that makes her stand out. And it's true that a lot of other people don't have that on portraiture, but it's false that other people were not doing that. So if you listen to my interview with Rosie Hart from a couple months ago, or read her book, frankly, The Royal Wardrobe, which is really good. She talks about Anne of Denmark. She's also posted videos about this. She's Rosie H. Hart on Instagram and TikTok. But the tits out neckline, Anne of Denmark made that happen. Anne of Denmark was a tits out icon, as it turns out. And we know this because royal ambassadors or whatever, like people coming to town who would be like, hey, here's what it's like in England. And they'd write back to their countries, you know, Spain or Italy or whatever. And they were just like, here's what's happening in England. Tits are out. Like, tits are out. Like, the Queen's neckline literally goes to her waist. Like, is what they wrote, like, to her waist. Like, her tits were out. As Rosie Hart explained, like, tits out was such a thing that people were applying makeup to, like, make their nipples different colors. They would use blue sort of, like, eyeliner to, like, emphasize, like, the veins on their, like, pale skin on their tits. Like, tits out was everywhere, but Puritanism and Protestantism was the name of the game at this point. So in portraits, Anne of Denmark is painted tits in because that was, I don't know, they wanted to show people were like not, I don't know, people were living tits out. There was not photography. There's only portraits, and the portrait painters covered up the tits, but the tits were out everywhere. And so Frances Howard's neckline was, she's not the only one doing it, but everyone was doing it. And what a time to be alive. And one of the reasons we also know for sure that these ambassadors weren't just exaggerating the tits out-ishness of it all is that when Anne of Denmark died, so they made a funeral effigy, which was like a thing they did, which is you kind of made a life-size like mannequin that looked like the person, and then you put them in like their favorite outfit, which is, I don't know, you know, cooler than like, you know, mummifying a body or whatever. Longer lasting. Anyway, so the funeral effigy, like we don't know what dress it was wearing, but the effigy itself still remains. So it's, and the way that it's done up is like the only parts that are like painted and like completed are the parts that would have been seen that aren't covered by the dress. So like you see her face, you see like her neck, you know, and you see her tits. So it's like the dress that she would have been wearing in effigy was like literally tits out. So it's a tits out era. So that's a correction. When I thought Frances was the only person doing this, no, she's just the only person being painted like this. I also wanted to mention, and I hadn't noticed when I first looked at the painting, but it became really important to know about, especially after I spoke with Lucy Jago, author of A Net for Small Fishes, the yellow ruffs of it all. And Rosie Hart talks about this in her book as well. So one of the people who actually wound up executed, one of the people implicated in the Overbury murder was Anne Turner. who was a very close friend of Frances Howard. In fact, when she was executed, Frances Howard wrote just devastating things about how can I go on without her and stuff. Like they were so close. They're really good friends. And that's kind of the basis of Lucy's novel, A Net for Small Fishes, was the friendship between these two women. Because as she mentioned in our interview, which you can find if you scroll back, I did a whole hour-long interview with Lucy Jago, just dishing about Frances Howard. What really moved her about the story was you don't often hear about women's friendship in history, but there was so much evidence of Frances Howard and Anne Turner and how close they really were in a friendship way. I'm not going to be like, oh, maybe they were lovers, but maybe they were lovers, but they were friends anyway. And Anne Turner was I'm trying to think of who to compare her to. It's not an Anna Wintour moment. It's Law Roach, I think, is the most famous celebrity stylist. He still styles for Zendaya. Anyway, she had a vision and a dream, and her vision and dream and a business was yellow ruffs. So the lacy collars on people's outfits that you see in portraits, she had access to the saffron to dye them yellow, and that became a big thing. And yellow in general, James the 1st/6th, who was a guy who wore the same clothes until they literally fell off his body, not a fashion girly. He was Protestant, and that was important to him and to his reign and stuff. And he was the whole thing with Protestants is you wear black and white, and that's what you do. Yellow had Catholic connections because the dye, I think, was procured from, I want to say Spain, and then it was imported through Ireland, Catholic countries. So to have yellow meant you were supporting the Catholics. It's kind of my millennials might remember after 9/11, there was a whole thing. Why was this? People America was really mad at France for some reason. And so they stopped calling them French fries. They started calling them freedom fries. So anyway, James was just stop wearing yellow ruffs. The other thing about yellow, people were wearing these yellow dyed coats, and the coats were challenging gender conventions because men wore them and women wore them. And James was I ban yellow. I ban yellow dyed ruffs. But everyone still kept doing it because no one took him seriously about fashion advice because look at him. So the yellow ruffs were a major thing. Anne Turner brought this in. She popularized it. It was a political statement to wear a yellow ruff. And if you look at the Frances Howard portrait, the one that's in the National Portrait Gallery in the red dress, the ruff on her dress is yellow. So that's a connection to Anne Turner, but also kind of showing that she was into fashion, but also a little bit politically minded, supporting Catholics at a time when that was not popular. And so I think I asked Lucy Jago and maybe also Rosie Hart, but if yellow ruffs are so popular, why don't you see them in more portraits from this time? And part of it is potentially the same reason you don't see the tits out. To make a portrait that's so permanent, that's your fashion statement is just being this is me and I'm doing this. It was kind of a bolder thing to do than to just show up one time in a party wearing a thing, because there's not photographs. Anyway, one of the other reasons is maybe people in portraits, so their ruffs might have just faded, the paint might have been yellow paint, but it faded to white. But also they might have just been painted white to look more Puritan adjacent. And then also, crucial, is that Frances Howard, and the reason I talked in the podcast, you're still listening to the podcast, but the one from 2020 about Frances Howard and did she fake her virginity test? And then was she the one behind the poisoning of Thomas Overbury and stuff? And the thing is, we don't know. Her trial was pretty ridiculous, and the decision was already made ahead of time what was going to happen. And if you really look, and this is all stuff I learned from Lucy Jago, just from her research and how she looked at it, it's okay, a couple things happened. So Robert Carr had been the favorite of King James, but then George Villiers came on the scene. His mom, Julianne Moore, in the TV show, pimped him out, and George Villiers started becoming the favorite. And then Robert Carr was just I don't know what to do about this. Often favorites would be great, I don't have to be the favorite anymore. I'll just take my dukedoms and go live in the country somewhere. But Robert Carr was no, I want to stay the favorite. And so it was kind of because he fought back. Then there was a faction who was against him. And then the murder of Thomas Overbury maybe could have gotten away with, except for Robert Carr fucked it all up by not letting go of his favorite status. But to be fair to him, he didn't know how to do anything else. So he had made so many enemies because the king listened to him so much. Even though he was basically a himbo, and all the stuff he told the king to do was what Thomas Overbury told him to tell the king. Anyway, the reason that this went to trial, even though everybody at court was doing shit like this all the time, it was a way that the enemies just saw this as a way to punish Robert Carr through this stuff. So if you look at the people who were arrested, which is like Robert Carr, who may or may not have even been involved, like that's still unknown if he actually, like he was certainly an accessory after the fact, but like was he complicit in the thing? I don't know. But the whole thing about like, you know, Frances was the mastermind or whatever, it's like we don't know that she was. Like, and she was certainly seemingly very involved, but it's unclear. The people who were executed for this were all the like not aristocrats, like the non-nobles. So Anne Turner really took the fall for this, where it's just like, what was her involvement in it? Anyway, so just what I do want to clarify is just like, we don't actually know how much of this stuff Frances Howard did. And the reason why she's portrayed as this like femme fatale is because of the George Villiers of it all, because like they had to make her look terrible because Robert Carr had enemies. And it's just like everyone was terrible, obviously, at this court. Like people were just like doing shitty things all the time. That's just what society was like. It was kind of like Gossip Girl, the TV show, where it's just kind of everyone's kind of shitty, but it's like you have to be shitty to survive. So anyway, Frances Howard, she certainly stands out to me, but to be like she was this notorious murderer is like not entirely true or valid, but she's important in so many ways. And so when I knew I was going to be revisiting this episode and her score, which, wait, let me just bring it up because it's like very, very, very low considering her importance to this podcast and everything she did in life, frankly. And so this is one that I'm going to be revisiting. So she has a score right now of 26, which is like a very common score a lot of people get on this show, but I feel like she deserves to revisit what this score is. And so I reached out to Lucy Jago, who, again, the first author I ever interviewed on this podcast. If you want to find our interview, it's an hour long. Just look up A Net for Small Fishes or Lucy Jago. It's Jago in wherever you listen to this podcast. But no, it was the first interview I ever did, and it was on Zoom, and the audio quality is not what it is now. But anyway, Christina, I've not yet got her to work her magic on that episode. But anyway, I wanted to ask Lucy Jago, who knows more about Frankie Howard than anyone, how she would score her in the various areas and just kind of what her thoughts were about it. And she sent me such a thoughtful response, and I'm going to read everything to you because she knows best in this era. So for scandaliciousness, here's what she wrote. Frances Howard caused tremendous scandal by asking for the annulment of her marriage to the Earl of Essex, arranged when she was around 14 and he was 13. Her request posed a massive challenge to the patriarchal order, especially as she was asking for it on the grounds of Essex's impotence. Essex was not impotent with prostitutes, only with his wife. It was argued that his todger, was bewitched. The countrywide debate the annulment proceedings provoked was savage, especially when Frances married the royal favorite Robert Carr 3 months later. During the hearings for the divorce, Frances was accused by a cunning woman of paying her to provide poisons to kill her husband, which did not add to her popularity. It adds to my love of her in my heart, but in that Puritan era, no. By the time a case was made against her for murder, Frances was already considered such a scandalous woman that murder was seen as being well within her capabilities. And Lucy suggests a 10 for scandaliciousness, and I absolutely agree. Tits out Frances Howard. How can you score her any less? Like, initially, I would score her highly in that just because of the tits out-ishness. And I'm like, oh, and she did this murder and whatever. But it's like, no, she, like the scandal of getting the annulment. And so I do want to emphasize, like, this was a time when like women couldn't bring divorce proceedings themselves. She had to convince her father to do this on her behalf. And the father was the one who had arranged the marriage. Like this was seen as just, she described it as like going against the patriarchal order. Like for a woman to be demanding a divorce on grounds of impotence was just like Herman my pills, but like times 1,000. Just like everyone was just like, how dare you? Even though everyone in this era was just like fucking everyone, they were also very, very Protestant. Anyway, I don't know, a wild time. 10 out of 10 for scandaliciousness for our girl Frankie. Scheminess. Here's what Lucy Jago says. I believe Frances was ambitious as well as scheming, not simply ambitious for high position at court, but for her own happiness. This was not a commonly held ambition for men or women at the time. One was meant to accept one's lot in life as ordained by God. But I don't think Frances held God in too high esteem and was far more interested in having a good time in this life than waiting for the next. She had been married very young to an awful, grumbling bore who despised women and was cruel and probably violent. It is not surprising she wanted to escape the marriage. His impotence was another insult, for it denied her the possibility of providing an heir, which was an aristocratic woman's way to achieving status and position. So yes, I think she was involved in schemes that would promote her agenda of finding personal happiness, such as meeting a cunning woman to get her rid of Essex, and being involved in a plot masterminded by her great-uncle to silence Sir Thomas Overbury. So here, Lucy is suggesting that she was involved in the plot to murder Thomas Overbury, but not that she herself was the one behind it, which is worth considering. Anyway, Lucy continues, mostly I think she wanted to marry a man of her own choosing, which at the time was considered outrageous, but which we have sympathy for today. So score 8, an 8 in scheminess. I absolutely agree. Significance. Here's what Lucy says. I think the scandals Frances became embroiled in had a great impact. Her annulment certainly caused a huge furore and prompted debate about the unhappiness of many couples pushed into arranged marriages when far too young to know their own minds. The king himself made it known he was not keen on the marriage of very young people or marriages arranged without any consideration of the suitability of the couple to be married. Frances's own sister was married at 18 to a man older than her grandfather, and her brother was betrothed to a girl of 8. Frances's father was already considered a little old-fashioned to be marrying his children off so young, and after the debacle of the Essex marriage, it became even more unusual to do so. The scandals she provoked, especially the Overbury scandal, dented the esteem in which the monarchy was held and has been frequently cited as one of the causes of the Civil War. And the Civil War is when Cromwell, etc., kicked off. So James the 1/6, this is an era I do not know very well. It's an era that British people know very well, it seems like. Anyway, so James the 1/6 son, his son Prince Charles died. No. His son Prince Charles lived. His son Prince Henry died. Anyway, Charles, his son, was the next king, and he was overthrown by Cromwell to take over the government. And then later on, James's grandson, Hot Charles II, Sexy Captain Hook, came back in and took over again. But you remember all the stuff with Hot Charles was like on the run, hiding in trees. Like that was like his dad. That was the Civil War, like when the monarchy was like briefly abolished in England. But this scandal dented the esteem in which the monarchy was held and has been frequently cited as one of the causes of the English Civil War. Certainly it showed James's court in a very bad light. Correctly, it was a wild place, and threw doubt of his manner of ruling, giving power to his favorites and possibly perverting or breaking the law in order to achieve his own aims. So for significance, Lucy scores Frances with a 7. Sexism. Okay, so here's Lucy. The patriarchal system into which Frances was born entirely dominated the way in which she was able to live her life. Her father was able to marry her off as a young teenager because his children, like his wife, were his property. Once married, Frances had no control over her finances or where she lived because she belonged to her younger husband. In theory, she couldn't even go shopping alone as married women were not allowed to make contracts. When seeking a divorce, Frances herself could not bring the case as married women had no legal power. They had fewer rights than children. So her father and great-uncle brought it on her behalf. Despite acknowledging his impotence, it was not Essex whose sexual behavior was questioned, but Frances, who had to undergo a physical examination to prove her virgin state. The annulment led to Frances being considered sexually voracious, as she sought to be satisfied in bed when women were not meant to express any sexual desire whatsoever other than be provoked by their husbands. In the court trials, the full sexism of the law was brought to bear over her. Women were considered to be born flawed, daughters of the sinner Eve, who were easily tempted into the paths of sin unless under the careful supervision of fathers and husbands. A woman who committed any sin, such as the sin of vanity for wearing makeup or being interested in fashion, was then considered capable of committing every sin, from infidelity to murder. Of course, she was tried by men with a jury of men and could not defend herself, as to speak in public would be to instantly condemn herself, as women were to be chaste, obedient, and silent. So she gives her a 9 for sexism, and that bumps Frances Howard from a 26 up to a 34, which I love because she deserves to be up in this top echelon. Like the 30 plus scores on Vulgar History are all the most, I don't know, I'm not going to say it's the most interesting, but like she deserves to be up there. Like 34, like Brunhild of Austrasia has a 34. Like I'm looking to see who else is here. Like Zhang Yisao, 35. Like Chevalier Dayon, 35.5. Like that's where Frances Howard belongs. Like, just in this tier of tits out legends. Like considering the impact she's had on this podcast, it's massive. So I'm really happy to be able to put her there again. I'm thinking about the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance, and I am going to give one for Anne Turner because she always, I didn't mention her lots in the podcast, but when you read Lucy's book, which again is fiction, but it's like so heavily researched, it's like based on what really happened. Anne Turner was so there for Frances Howard, like making her these amazing outfits, but also just like supporting her, helping her with her murder plans. Like they were besties, like their friendship, like the way that Frances Howard was absolutely gutted and devastated when Anne Turner took the fall for this murder. Like it really speaks to the depth of their support and love for each other. And nobody's at the Jeweled Tortoise level here, I don't think, for Frances Howard. So yeah, you're listening to this and it's like mid/late December. Holidays are upon us. I hope you're all doing well. This is a stressful time for a lot of people. I do want to mention that if you're looking for a last minute gift for somebody, if you're someone who celebrates Christmas and gives gifts, a last minute gift that will arrive in time is if you want to get a little video message from me. It's a thing I'm doing just until Christmas on Cameo, which is like what it is. It costs like $10 or something. And then you just say, here's what I want the message to say. So I could just be like, hey, tits out, whatever, just as a last minute gift for somebody who's on the Tits Out Brigade or for yourself. Anyway, the link to that is in the show notes and everywhere. Just go to Cameo and look for me. Anyway, another gift that's always in style. Just talking about, I don't know, this is why I love having this as one of our brand partners, Common Era Jewelry. Just because we've talked so much about like the importance of jewelry and fashion. Like back in the day, women couldn't own property or things. Like what they could own was jewelry. So like when a marriage split up or whatever, if you were widowed, like you could sell your jewelry. That's where you get your money from. Actually, I forget if I said this in the podcast before, but remember when we were talking about Margaret Fleming and she had that like wildly huge amount of raw wool in her castle? So it turns out that that's a way that women could also amass wealth when they couldn't be given property or literal money, was just having wool. So anyway, Common Era Jewelry is our brand partner. And one of the things about the jewelry that she makes, Tori is the name of the woman who runs the company. I do want to mention that the Anne Boleyn gold vermeil necklace is available, hopefully still available, just in limited quantities. And so that's a more affordable option to get. It's a beautiful necklace. The front of it is a portrait of Anne Boleyn. The back just says Anne. Beautiful. Anyway, and you can always get 15% off from Common Era Jewelry with code VULGAR. But what's really great about this, or any jewelry, honestly, is to be able to have something as a keepsake to pass down. And I appreciate that the tradition of giving jewelry as a keepsake came from back when women weren't able to have money. But it's a way to give somebody who you love a gift. And then in future, if they need, it's just a way to safeguard them by giving them something lovely that lasts. Anyway, Common Era Jewelry is a 100% women-owned business using 100% recycled gold and makes all their pieces made to order, which means there is no waste. When you place an order, they make the item, so there's not lots sitting around being unused. The pieces are entirely made in New York City, so everyone involved has healthcare and good wages. Even the packaging is made by a lovely little family-owned business in Chicago. Their designs are inspired by classical mythology, as well as women from history, including their latest collection, all about difficult women. And it's funny because I think she posted at some point, Tori, about Common Era, and she's like, who are some other people who you'd like to see? And I was like, Fredegund. And I'm like, Frances Howard. But like, I know that these people are famous to us, but like the people who she has on her jewelry are people who are like very famous to lots of people. So we're talking about like Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina, Anne Boleyn, as well as mythological women like Medusa and Aphrodite. Oh, she also has Sappho is one of the ones that's there. And actually, it's just a little Easter egg for you. If you look through her Difficult Women collection, one of the women there is somebody who I'm working on an episode about for next year. So that's a little spoiler for you. Anyway, so again, Vulgar History listeners can always get 15% off items from Common Era by going to commonera/vulgar or using code VULGAR at checkout. And you can always get in touch with me using the form at vulgarhistory.com or emailing me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also catch up with me on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. I'm also on TikTok at Vulgar History, where I've been doing some TikToks lately. I like wax and wane in my use of TikTok, but I'm on there more at the moment. You can also get your Vulgar History merch, including a beautiful drawing of Frances Howard that says tits out, written in the font and spelling of her era. So it's like TYTTES OUTTES. It's like titties, OTs. You can get that design on a t-shirt and lots of things we have 2 merch stores. So if you go to vulgarhistory.com/store, that's the best one for US people. That's a TeePublic store. Or if you're outside the US, the shipping is a lot better if you go to our Redbubble store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com, where we've got our holiday design, Tits the Season, designed by Karen Moynihan from the Double Love podcast, and also a new design of Lola Montez, which is kind of like pinup girl style, done by an artist whose name is Iris, who is from Spain. Anyway, it brings me great joy to know that people are enjoying Vulgar History merch. And I hope if you give a gift, the person who gets it loves it. You can also support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. That could be a gift. I'm just thinking of like last minute things, digital gifts you get immediately or whatever, instead of having to wait for something to ship that might not arrive in time. You could gift somebody a membership to the Patreon. That would be a nice present for a friend of yours who's in the Tits Out Brigade. Anyway, so for $1 a month, or you can pay for like a year upfront. That's where I'm thinking that could be the gift. For $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes. And for $5 a month, which you can also pay upfront for a year on behalf of someone else if you wanted, you get the early ad-free access as well as bonus episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater, where we talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. We have an episode coming up shortly. It's kind of a Christmas special. We're talking about a Christmas movie, which is called The Lion in Winter, which does technically take place at Christmas. Anyway, that's coming up on Vulgar Piece Theater. And then also I do episodes of So This Asshole, where I talk about horrible men from history. Like so many from this episode are there. I've done a George Villiers one. I've done one on James the 1st/6th. And if and when I get to 500 Patreons, I'm going to do one about John Knox. So if that's incentive for you to join. You can also get transcripts of this podcast of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Evelyn Malik from the Wordery for providing these transcripts. And yeah, until next time, like I say this every episode, and I've said it every episode for a long time, like tits out, like Frances Howard, like her tits out manner of dress, we now know was not just her, but like she really typified it in the same way that Y2K, lots of people are dressing a certain way, but like Britney Spears looked the best doing it. And Frances Howard, I think, was the tits out icon of her era. Her tits out lifestyle, like as I've since learned, since I recorded the original episode, like it transcends just wearing a certain neckline or, even being involved in maybe a murder to make herself happy, like all the stuff, like challenging the patriarchy, like burning it down, like for her own happiness, like that's goals. When I say tits out, that's an important part of the lifestyle. It's just like, it can be literal tits out. It can be tits in, but psychologically tits out. And so in all of the ways, everybody keep your pants on and your tits out. And I'll talk to you again next week. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
I'm Brendan Storr. I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.